Well, good afternoon from Two Happy Children Farm. I'm in the office today, and I thought it'd be a good time to give you guys some of my plant tissue test data that I've gathered over the last several years and what I've learned and what I've been doing with the data. I know we're all trying to improve our profitability and find things that would improve our yields as well as our overall profit. So I'm going to walk you through what I've learned and what I've done on this field starting when I took it over in 2016. So in 2016, my final yield was around 115 bushels on this field. This has been one of my harder fields to work with. Going into the season, you'll see I have a 2.4% organic matter. My P was 14 parts per million on the Olsen. K was 196, and my percent potassium was 1.3%. So what I'd seen in that year was I take tissue tests at different heat units. So the different stages of growth I took it at was at V4, V12, and then as tassel emerges. And I've done that across this exact same spot from 2016 up to 2022 and taken the data. So what I saw in 2016 were the numbers for the percent nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium when I'm at a small plant at V4 were very good. And this data has been derived from Midwest Labs, is where I've been sending my tissue tests. So on the left side here, I just take a cumulative value of how much I'm off. So Midwest Labs will tell you the sufficient number, and then I take how far am I off from sufficient. So in this case, I had 11% too much nitrogen. I had a little bit too much phosphorus. I had a little bit, not quite enough potassium. So I sum up those numbers and I get an NPK delta of 10.4%. And then if I look at just potassium and phosphorus, I'm barely 1% miss. So I'm feeling confident in 2016 that things are looking good. But what happens is if you don't have the right amount of what I found was potassium, later in the season those numbers fall apart. So even in this year where I'd applied at least 1.2 pounds of nitrogen per bushel goal, by the time I reached 1200 heat units, that cumulative number was missing by 62%. And the big miss was 28% in potassium, phosphorus, 18% in potassium, and another 15 in nitrogen. So even at that case, I still wasn't getting enough nitrogen. Come back a week later, maybe there's a rain or something that happened, and I'm off by 35% for that cumulative number. Fast forward to 2018, we had a really wet early time, and then the rain shut off after tassel. So in that case, I hadn't really adjusted my fertility. I'd only been applying for yield goals, so the right amount of potassium, right amount of phosphorus, and right amount of nitrogen. From my soil test, they give you your targets, and that's what I was applying. So this early test was not as good as 2016. The V12 test was a lot better, and then the tassel test was a lot better than 2016. So I think over that time I built the soil just slightly, but after tassel we didn't get any rain, so it resulted in a 70 bushel crop. Going forward from 2019, we looked like we kept repeating the same mistakes over and over again. So on this field, I went ahead and applied 1,000 pounds of 0060 and 500 pounds of 1846-0, along with 50 pounds of zinc sulfate. So it was like a real big jump for me to fix this field, but I wanted to see if it would respond. So 5 years later, my organic matter reads 3.6%. Actually, this is post 2022, but I'm pretty sure we're about there right now. My P parts per million is 25, K is 280, and my percent K is 2.2%. Now, while we didn't have an ideal 5 weeks of the early season, my initial V4 readings were within less than 10%. But what happened this year that hadn't happened before was my ear leaf and my tassel time readings, instead of falling down to this area, was down to 62% at ear leaf. In this good year, I was at a positive 17%. So the plant difference was night and day. Plant height, plant girth, plant health, everything was different. So by V12, I still had a really good number on N, P, and K. At tassel, we lost a little bit because I think we were dry that week. But still, by missing by 24%, that's a lot better than 2016 by 35%. So those 2 weeks were really good, while V4 wasn't quite as good. 2022, we only got 4 inches of rain for the whole season, so there was never a good reading for any of these. So again, my early data didn't look good just because we haven't had any rain to settle. I think we'd only had maybe 2 inches since planting, like 6 weeks earlier. And then my upper leaf and my VT readings were terrible because they were about 3 inches 3 weeks after the last rain. But they did remind me a lot of the 2018 drought. So you could start to predict now if your upper leaf and VT leaf readings were low, it was going to be difficult to get that through to a good yield. So what I'm thinking going forward, you can see the differences for a 90 bushel crop and a 185 bushel crop. This was moisture generated. And then you can see the difference between a 185 bushel crop and a 115 bushel crop. Let's assume the moisture was the same, but the difference was the fertility. And you can see the readings on the tissue tests, which showed where the fertility changes were. So if you're going to have do a tissue test program, I would expect if your crop is growing normal and you get normal rain, you're going to see really good numbers up to V4, V6. That's when the plant's just starting to get going, especially on NP and K. There's not going to be a lot you can do if you don't have the NP and K out initially. But when the numbers start falling apart is when you hit, this is like the 1200 heat unit range, and then the tassel range. Those numbers will really start to fall apart once that crop hasn't had enough P and K going into that time frame, like for the whole lifetime of the crop. So if you're going to do a tissue testing next year, do it early, see where you're at. You may be able to adjust some micronutrients at that time. Don't go crazy on your yield goals yet. And then do it again at right before tassel, V12, and then again at tassel, and look at those numbers. If they're still holding on as sufficient, then you're in good shape. If there's an area where you're a bit low on those, that would be where you'd want to work on next. So for me, what I found was P and K were important, but I think K was the most important. And I also found a little bit of relationship to sulfur. So on my best yielding year, I also was very sufficient on sulfur. So basically with 3 trips to the field to do tissue tests, you can learn a lot. If you've never done it before and you want to baseline your field, you may want to do TENS test. So start at V5 and then do a test every week, and then see where you're at. The labs will tell you when you're sufficient or deficient. It's not a big deal if you're deficient a week or two during those 10 weeks because the rains come and the rains go. But I think the main thing is once you reach that fully mature plant, that those levels of K and P need to be right there where they need to be, because that's all the uptake that's going to happen for the year. And I've also demonstrated it on other fields that were lower yielding, that they look like rock stars up to about V7, and then they started falling behind very quickly compared to my fields. They just didn't get the plant, they didn't get the canopy coverage, and by about, I'd say 900 heat units, they were behind by about 10% on the crop canopy coverage. So they might have 50% of the area covered on the ground, and mine would be at 60%. So you can actually see the difference as you go through the season. So maybe this helps some people. Again, I think the best tool I found was looking at the cumulative relationship between NP and K, and using that sufficient number that you'll get from your tissue test, and just compare how deficient you were compared to that sufficiency number. If you're seeing a big gap, then that's the one to fix. And oftentimes when I first started, I could see a really huge overkill on nitrogen. So that's where I was at. And that extra nitrogen early in the plant life didn't do me any good when it came to building the whole thing. So let me know if you have any questions, and I hope this helps. Thank you.